The 8th of April 1940, the Norwegian Sea. Heavy weather, visibility falling in and out of rain squalls. A British destroyer of 1,345 tons, alone, already damaged from an earlier fight, sights a German warship emerging from the mist. She is the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper, over 14,000 tons fully loaded, carrying 8 8-inch guns to the destroyer's 4 7-inch, armored where the destroyer has none at all. There is no version of this encounter the destroyer can win by fighting fair. 20 minutes later, badly holed, on fire, and with no torpedoes left to fire, her captain turns the ship's bow directly into the cruiser's side. This is the story of HMS Glowworm, the destroyer that should have simply died at long range, and instead took a chunk of a German heavy cruiser with her. By early April 1940, the Royal Navy had no idea Germany was about to invade Norway. Glowworm was part of the destroyer screen for a British mine-laying operation in Norwegian waters, escorting the battlecruiser HMS Renown North through some of the worst seas the North Atlantic could produce. On the night of the 6th into the 7th, a man was swept overboard from Glowworm in heavy weather, and her captain, Lieutenant Commander Gerard Broadmead Roop, turned the ship out of formation to search for him, a routine act of care for one sailor that separated Glowworm from the rest of the British force in conditions of poor visibility and rising seas. By the time the search ended without finding the man, Glowworm had lost contact with Renown's group entirely and was operating alone, attempting to rejoin in exactly the stretch of sea that a German invasion fleet, entirely unknown to the British at that moment, was steaming directly through. Operation Weserübung, Germany's invasion of Norway and Denmark, was already underway, and part of that invasion force was a group of German destroyers escorting troops toward Trondheim, itself covered at a distance by Admiral Hipper. Naval doctrine of the period held that a lone destroyer stumbling into a superior enemy force at sea had exactly one sensible option: run, using smoke and speed to break contact and report the enemy's position, because a destroyer's entire tactical value in a mismatched encounter was as a scout, not a combatant. Nobody expected a single destroyer, unsupported, to seek out and fight a heavy cruiser. The specifications made the outcome obvious before a shot was fired. Glowworm's 4 7-inch guns fired a 50-pound shell with limited range and no armor-piercing capability worth the name against a cruiser's belt. Hipper's 8-inch guns fired a shell weighing well over 250 pounds, with far greater range, from behind armor that could shrug off nearly anything Glowworm carried. Hipper could also make close to 32 knots to Glowworm's roughly 36, a narrow enough margin that outrunning her in heavy seas, with Glowworm already battered from the search and rescue detour, was far from guaranteed. On paper, the only rational move was to turn away immediately and never let the range close far enough for Hipper's guns to matter. That is not what happened, because by the time Glowworm's lookouts identified 2 unknown destroyers early on the morning of the 8th, she was already committed to finding out what they were, and the answer arrived faster than retreat could have saved her. If you're finding this deep dive into Royal Navy destroyer actions interesting, subscribing takes a second and supports the channel. Glowworm engaged the German destroyers first, in a running gun battle through rough seas that damaged one of the German ships, Bernd von Arnim, before Hipper herself arrived to support her smaller consorts. Roop now faced the exact mismatch naval doctrine said should never be fought. He made smoke immediately, laying a screen to obscure Glowworm's position and buy time, and turned to use the weather itself as cover, the same heavy swell that had made the night search so difficult, now working in the destroyer's favor by breaking up the German cruiser's fire control solutions. Hipper's Kapitän zur See Helmut High opened fire through the smoke and rain, straddling Glowworm repeatedly as she maneuvered violently to avoid a clean hit. Glowworm fired her remaining torpedoes at Hipper during this exchange, forcing the German cruiser to turn away to avoid them, a temporary reprieve that cost Roop more time than distance. Hipper's guns found Glowworm's hull. Shell hits tore into her upperworks, started fires amidships, and wrecked much of her superstructure, killing and wounding crew across the ship. Glowworm had no torpedoes left, no realistic gunnery solution against an armored cruiser at any range her own guns could reach, and no speed advantage left to escape with. Her engines already strained from the earlier action and the night's detour. Every option that naval doctrine offered a destroyer in this position had already been used or foreclosed. Roop had one asset left: The ship's own mass and momentum, and the fact that Hipper, confident in her armor and firepower, had continued to close the range rather than stand off and simply finish Glowworm from a distance she could not answer. Roop ordered the helm put over, and drove Glowworm's bow directly into Hipper's starboard side. The destroyer struck the cruiser forward, tearing open roughly 40 meters of Hipper's hull plating along the waterline and damaging one of her torpedo tubes and part of her forward structure, flooding compartments below the point of impact. Glowworm herself, already burning and holed by gunfire, began to break up from the force of the collision almost immediately. She rolled and sank within minutes. Of a crew of around 149 men, only 31 were pulled from the freezing water, and they were rescued not by another British ship, because there was none nearby, but by Hipper herself, whose captain ordered his own crew to recover survivors from the destroyer that had just torn a hole in his ship's side. Captain High's report on the action, submitted through his own chain of command, was unusually direct in its respect for the destroyer he had just sunk, describing the disproportionate courage of a much smaller ship that had continued to fight and had ultimately rammed a vessel many times its size rather than simply going down under gunfire alone. That report eventually reached British authorities after the war, through international Red Cross channels and post-war access to German naval records, and it formed the basis for Lieutenant Commander Roop being awarded the Victoria Cross in 1945, 5 years after his death. One of the rare instances in which an enemy officer's own account of an action directly supported the case for a British Gallantry Award. The material effect of the ramming was limited. Hipper was damaged but remained operational, continuing her mission to cover the landing at Trondheim, and the German invasion of Norway proceeded largely as planned. Glowworm did not change the campaign's outcome, and nobody watching only the strategic map that week would have called the action decisive. But that was never really the measure of what happened in those 20 minutes. A destroyer with no armor, no realistic gunnery advantage, and no torpedoes left had been given every reason by doctrine, by tonnage, and by simple arithmetic to break off and run, and instead had closed the distance to zero and taken a piece of an armored cruiser with her rather than simply going down at range. The Royal Navy's own tactical manuals had no column for that decision. It wasn't a calculation. It was a choice made after every calculated option had already run out. HMS Glowworm never fired another shot after that morning, and she never needed to. A destroyer built to be the smallest, most expendable class of warship in the fleet had in her final 20 minutes forced one of Germany's most powerful cruisers to limp onward with a torn hull and a story its own captain felt compelled to tell honestly. The specifications said a 1,345-ton destroyer had no business fighting a 14,000-ton cruiser, let alone damaging one. The specifications were right about the odds, and wrong about what a crew with no options left would actually do with the ship they had. 40 meters of German steel, torn open below the waterline. 31 survivors pulled from the water by the enemy that sank them, and a Victoria Cross awarded on the word of the captain whose ship had been rammed